Hello. I would like to tell you a story today. A story that is pretty unusual, but I feel like I should tell it nonetheless. I don't actually remember the exact beginning of this story. I do know that when I was in second grade, we were read Horton Hears a Who in library class, the Dr. Seuss story, which is about an elephant who finds these microscopic people living on a flower and then tries to convince the other animals that they exist, that they're real. Which is a bit odd, but it's a children's book. I'm certain this was the first trigger. The second thing that happened was a couple weeks later when the school nurse came into our classroom and began combing through everyone's hair with her fingers, looking for head lice. And when I was in second grade, I didn't have a lot of friends. This was more through choice than anything else. I did have a few, but at recess time, I usually ignored them in favor of wandering around by myself. Obviously, I don't remember everything that I did, but I do remember I spent a lot of time, most of the time probably, in the world of the Who's and the Lice. Pretty weird names, but you have to remember I was only 7 years old. In my mind, I created the story, a universe in which the world was the stage and the backdrop. Here, the distant radio towers could be towering beacons many miles tall, rocks could be fortified cities, paperclips could be battle cruisers looming in the air. I say I would use the world around me as a setting, or as a backdrop, but it was selective. Things I didn't want in the world I simply ignored. Like, a few times I tried to incorporate the existence of actual people, not getting other people to participate. I never told anyone about this, but just having the other people, other kids that were walking around the playground, part of the story. But it never felt right, and I just ended up pretending that they never existed. As I said, the people were called the Who's and the Lice. They were almost microscopic in the analogy. Nothing ever represented the actual physical existence of one of them. I'd pick up paper clips from the classroom, twigs and wood chips from the playground, corners of paper from my workbooks, and little pieces of paper from hole punches to be the battle cruisers and fighters. I pulled apart little bits of erasers to make tanks, each bit the size of like the head of a pin, the largest. But a Who or a Louse individually would be the size of the tiniest grain of sand, just outside the range of human vision. They never existed in the real world, to me. My mind, it was always just an alternate reality where this stuff was happening. And the Who's and the Lice were at war, of course, for being in second grade. And slowly but surely a story came out of my playground pastime. I did not establish a real reason for why they were at war. That didn't come for a very long time. One of the earliest aspects of the story that I remember creating were the characters Peter and Emily Green, who were the leaders of the Who's. They were a couple, although it was a long time before I figured out for sure whether they got married yet or not. I was 7 or 8, and such things weren't very important to me. They were the best pilots and soldiers that the Who's had to offer, and they were in the center of nearly every battle. Whether they had to land in the back of a Louse ship in jetpacks and take it over from the crew, or fly a bombing mission vital to the success of an offensive, or rescue someone, they were always on the front lines. And they had a nemesis called Timeless, who they met again and again. He was quite the recurring villain. They battled with him many times. He had a special, customized fighter that had an hourglass-shaped profile when it was flying towards you, looking almost like a X-Wing from Star Wars crossed with an old biplane. Most of the battles were between cruisers in the air, firing their railguns and missiles and, at that time, lasers at each other. Certain parts of the playground, especially rocks and trees, were cities and fortresses that they were fighting for control of. There were a lot of infantry battles, but I preferred to act out the battles in the air because they meant I could walk around using things I could hold, so the infantry battles would mostly take place off-screen, in a way. Around 4th to 5th grade, the Who's began to enter the school, which I decided was a giant Death Star-like super fortress that the Lice had built, named Wobaron. This is where all their soldiers and fighters and cruisers were coming from. It had some sort of a giant weapon, missiles, or nuclear bombs under construction, and the Who's were attacking Super Fortress, and eventually they got inside it and began to wage war within it, and this lasted until the end of elementary school, this part. And on the last, I still did things outside at recess, but it was also a lot more during class because I got bored during class, and so sometimes I would do this stuff in my head. So, on the last day of 5th grade, we all got on the buses to go to the local middle school for move-up day. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's basically meeting your teachers for the next year so they aren't completely new to you when you go in to start next year. For me, as the buses pulled out on that last day of school, the Who's were fleeing the dying Wobaron, which was about to explode, and they had won for now, and they were setting off for a new place, hopefully looking for a new future. On the way, during the bus ride, they were attacked by another Louse fleet, which was flying towards Wobaron in retaliation. Peter and Emily's ship was heavily damaged, and they were losing altitude fast. They ended up crash landing in a black, rocky desert, and in the distance they could see the outline of another super fortress, just like Wobaron. And that was where I left the story for the summer. I should say, at this time, I didn't have anything to do with this Who's story during the summer, or at home at all. It felt unclean to me for some reason, like it didn't belong there, like it only belonged at school. Maybe I felt like it was an insult to having better things to do at home, that I would pretend in this little story world. Maybe I thought it just belonged at school. I guess in a lot of ways I was strangely ashamed of my story. Again, I never told anyone about it. At the beginning of 6th grade, that fall, the war began afresh as Peter and Emily and the other survivors left the wreckage of their crashed ship and began to make their way through the canyons of the rocky desert, seeking shelter in the caves. These canyons were cracks in the blacktop, or the parking lot where we would go outside for recess in middle school. Slowly but surely, Peter and Emily found scattered groups of Who's, a ship here and there, and they battled the Lice in the rocky desert, and slowly they began to rally a fleet to take on this second super fortress, which I named McAlevey. And these names, I didn't actually name them that at the time, because I didn't really have any reason to name them at the time. But I did name them later after the fact, and it's more convenient to use these names so we can tell them apart. At some point I introduced the character of Myron. He was a bit like Gurney Halleck from Dune, if you've read that book. I didn't until quite a few years after that, but in retrospect the analogy seems pretty fitting. He was a loyal friend of Peter and Emily's, and he was like a family friend, but he was not a servant, but he would probably do anything for Peter if he had to. He might have been from back in elementary school. He might have been one of the original characters, but if he was, I can't remember if he was. I made him that when I started writing the story later, because that seemed like the best way for things to be. The siege of McAlevey lasted for 2 years in real time, but for 20 long years in the story. Peter and Emily got married and had a son and a daughter, named Orion and Cassiopeia, respectively. Myron helped raise Orion and Cassiopeia. Orion was an excellent warrior and soldier, and Cassiopeia was an excellent pilot, the best pilot, although Orion wasn't too bad of a pilot himself. And they came of age in a world ruled by war. I don't remember a lot of the details of that time. After 20 years had passed in the story, however, Peter was not aging, and neither was Emily. It was around this time that they began to learn that they were chosen. Now, normally, even back then, I hated it when there were prophecies or destined ones in stories, but I needed an explanation for why they'd survived so long. Even as a young child, I realized that the best soldier would still run out of luck eventually. So the chosen abilities, wherever they came from, granted both slowed aging and the ability to occasionally, at just the right moment, see when something was going to happen before it did. It was kind of a convenient plot device. They could see if someone was sneaking up on them or dodge out of the way of an explosion while they were flying, or something similar. Time would just slow down and they'd know that they could get out of the way. The last day of 7th grade, for me, felt like an escape, because I'd been miserable in middle school. People picked on me, although it doesn't mean I didn't have any friends. I had a few friends. I hated the classes, the schoolwork. I didn't enjoy going to school at all. So, as a solution, I was going to be homeschooled for 8th grade, which I felt pretty uncertain about, obviously, but I figured it had to be better than another year at middle school. So, the last day of 7th grade, as I walked out to the buses lined up in the parking lot, the other students flirting around me excitedly, ready for summer vacation. It was the Who fleet bursting free of McAlevey, fresh from placing tactical nuclear bombs at key stress points within the super fortress. The Louse fleet loomed outside, hoping to cut off the Who fleet from escaping in one last titanic battle. Hundreds of ships were destroyed as they fled, hoping to get far away from McAlevey before it exploded and collapsed. Peter and Emily died in that battle. They sacrificed themselves to save Orion and Cassiopeia. Their ship careened into the firestorm that was waiting below. But most of the Who fleet did escape. Orion and Cassiopeia and Myron survived, and McAlevey was annihilated behind them. It was at this point that I began to feel less and less disgusted, I guess, with the story. It's not really the right word. Or at least it didn't seem like it was something that didn't belong at home. Probably because I didn't have a school to go back to. I didn't have to go back to a school where I was miserable, so... I did pretty well with homeschooling the first year. I mean, I actually did schoolwork. I took a couple of classes still at another middle school in my town. And, in the story, the shattered Who fleet had escaped McAlevey, and they'd wandered aimlessly for a couple of months. And eventually they found a titanic tree, miles tall, converted into a city/fortress. And it was bristling with defenses, including a shield system that could hold up under siege for years and years. This was a tree outside my house, and I named it Serengarth. It was one of the few places I actually named at the time. I didn't go back and name it later. So Orion and Cassiopeia and the rest of the Who fleet landed at Serengarth, and the Serengarthians took them in. And they discovered that though the fortress was powerful, like I said, it had nearly impenetrable shields, but the leader was corrupt. He was merely a puppet of his evil son, Diometric. And he only wanted power for himself. He was obsessed with it. And his sister, Xenia, could do little to nothing to stop him. So Orion, as they began living there, he began to slowly gather evidence against Diometric. He caught him slipping poison into his father's food, caught him killing one of the McAlevey survivors, and that was because Diometric hated Orion and Cassiopeia and the other people who came with them, but he'd had no choice but to take them in. Orion eventually exposed Diometric for murdering his own father, and challenged him to a knife duel in the throne room of Serengarth. And Orion won. Diometric was dead, and so was Diometric's father, the actual ruler, because Diometric had poisoned him. Xenia was heir to the throne, because she was Diometric's sister, and Orion ended up marrying her, as a symbol of the alliance between the McAlevey Whos and the Serengarth Whos. And he was sort of in love with her, but it was mostly a marriage of alliance. So Serengarth was free of the evil control of Diometric, and just in time, because the Louse fleet was swelling in greater numbers than Orion and Cassiopeia had ever seen or known. The first snow of winter, imagine every snowflake is an attack ship coming down from the sky in countless amounts. That was what it was for me, watching the snowfall for the first time that year. Serengarth was a powerful fortress, however, and it held off the huge enemy invasion. It was a long, cold, bitter winter, but Serengarth lasted through the siege. And when spring came, they struck back. Serengarth and the other Hu cities and strongholds launched their fleets against the Lao super fortresses. To me, going to the mall, for example, walking between the cars towards the building was like flying between siege cruisers attacking a titanic fortress. Orion and Cassiopeia, and sometimes Myron, would fly missions into these super fortresses, the local mall or supermarket or wherever we went, usually to attack one of the shield generators inside of it in hopes of weakening it. Each new winter was a fresh assault by the lice, more and more ships coming down from the sky. Occasionally when I did yard work, or I was shoveling snow, I would think about this battle, and sometimes I'd just wander outside after school and think about it, or occasionally I'd have a twig or a stick in my hand, but I'd really grown out of that part of the whole thing. At one point, the next year, Xenia was killed when a branch of Serengarth was destroyed during a battle. Orion was literally just a few feet away from her. They were running through the hallway, and it cracked in half and fell away, taking her and hundreds of others with it. A branch actually did break off the tree. And another tree near Serengarth was actually destroyed during the second siege. This was something that actually happened too. A tree toppled over in my front yard during a windstorm. When I was 14, my family took a trip to Arizona in the spring, and we took the plane out. In my head, this was an opportunity for Ryan to go on a sort of special mission. He found something in the Serengarth library about a fallen city containing a secret weapon, millions of kilometers to the west across this huge world. Orion realized it would take months and months to get there in a regular cruiser, so he decided to hitch a ride aboard one of the Lao super transporters that flew impossibly high in clouds. You can probably guess that I'm talking about airplanes. I adapted quite a few aspects of the world around me to work as props for the world in my head, especially since it became something I did outside of school. Power lines, the big transformer towers that cut through the woods in a lot of places around where I lived, became giant sky train towers, which was a huge infrastructure of train transport that the lice used to move their troops around. So they flew to the airport, which in my mind was a giant fortress with a landing strip for the huge transport cruisers that the lice used. And they stole a captured Laos cruiser to get to the airport. Just Orion, Cassiopeia, Myron, and a few others. And when they arrived, it was not long before they were found out. But they escaped into the super cruiser before they were caught, and they managed to evade being searched out. And when they arrived at the other airport, they escaped, shot down the lice that were following them, and set off for this mysterious ruin. Of course, there were Who's here too, building cities in the giant mountains and rocks, battling the lice in the giant desert mountains. The scope of this was quite epic for me. Orion learned that the Who's had once had a huge empire, spanning all across the planet, and the lice, wherever they had come from, had torn through it, leaving not much of the empire left but scattered remnants like Serengarth, or the Who's that were living in around McAllivay, or Wobaron. Orion found the secret weapon he was looking for. It was a type of cloaking technology, which wasn't quite as good as he had hoped for, but it was still something pretty excellent. They returned to Serengarth not long later, using the same methods. And then a third attack on Serengarth came, and then a fourth over the next 2 years. Orion realized there were so many lice that there was no question how the war would end, more a matter of when. But he was one of the few to see the true immensity of their enemy as they flew in the giant cruiser, super cruiser on the way back, unbelievably high above the ground, watching clouds that were thick with Laos cruisers slowly migrating east to attack, and he knew that Serengarth and the other stronghold would have to fall one day. Next year we went on a trip to Yellowstone. This was another journey for Orion. While it was the first time he'd found mention of a schism, and a place called Fan Row. Eventually he determined its location, and that it was the old capital of the ancient Hu Empire. So that was their next goal, to go there and learn as much as they could about their past, about how the lice had come into being, and what they could do to destroy them. The journey to Fainrow was much the same as the previous journey. When they eventually made it to Fainrow, they found a cracked, dried landscape, volcanic and flattened by nuclear war. Boiling rivers ran thick with colorful bacteria, and geysers formed huge mountains that stood out over the bleached landscape. Orion began to have flashbacks as they traveled through a forest of fallen city trees, many of them the same size as Serengarth, or even larger. He saw things that must have happened thousands, if not tens of thousands of years ago, watching the now still husks of tree trunks burning and falling, louse ships swarming all around them. They eventually met other Whos here as well. The one in particular they landed at, the village, was led by a man named Tenebrock and his sister Kalana. They told Tenebrock that what they were looking for, and that they wanted to learn more about the schism. And Tenebrock told them that there was a cave along a huge cliff near a waterfall, hundreds of miles away, that would answer their questions. So they flew there, Orion going with Kalana, and Tenebrock went with them as well. Along the way, some lice caught up with them and shot down the ship that Orion and Kalana were on. They survived the crash along with a few others, but then the lice landed and killed everyone but Orion and Kalana, but they managed to escape. Cassiopeia and Tenebrock and Myron were waiting in another ship, and when they saw Orion and Kalana's ship be shot down, they thought they were either dead or missing, and they flew back to the village. Orion and Kalana survived, and they continued along the cliffside. They spent the night in a small alcove along the side of the cliff, and they began to get to know each other. And at this time, they began to fall in love. Then the next morning, they continued along to the cave. Inside, they met strange creatures. They were half-panther, half-insect creatures with scimitar claws, emaciated monsters with, very long claws, all sorts of very strange creatures. And they fought and killed them all, either with guns or with knives, and continued on through the cave. Kalana was certainly no warrior, but she could hold her own, having lived in the village for so many years. Eventually they made it to the inner sanctum of the cave. Here they found a glowing light, hovering, a solid white orb hanging in the middle of this giant chamber. And as Orion began to approach it, pain began to grow in his forehead, closer and closer and closer to becoming just completely intolerable. But he forced himself forward, despite the pain, and eventually he just stumbled forward and began to have visions in his head as the pain overwhelmed him. An ancient city full of Whos, a war burning it, the blinding light of atomic fire, and a Who becoming a louse, or a louse becoming a Who, or maybe they were the same thing. Suddenly, in his head, somehow, Orion knew that the lice had once been Whos. When he came out of his trance, Timeless was waiting for him, not far away, escorted by a pair of emaciated humanoids with long, sword-like claws for arms, as well as a few other louse soldiers. He had had quite a few encounters with Timeless over the years, in Macaleve and in Serengarth, but he had never seen those kinds of creatures before. In the ensuing combat, he killed them, as well as the louse soldiers, and fought Timeless to a standstill before escaping. Out there, he managed to use the radio in the craft to call, signal for help, before turning to fight Timeless again. Eventually, Tenebrock and his soldiers showed up in a landing craft, scared off Timeless, and rescued Orion and Kalana, plucking them from the cliffside. Tenebrock got into an escort fighter and flew onward, saying that the Louse fleet was tearing through the massive valley where they lived, heading towards the ruins of Fainrow, and that the villagers were rallying for war. As they flew back, the lice launched several missiles after the fleeing Who ships. Tenebrock bravely sacrificed himself to lead them away, and Kalana was, of course, unbelievably grief-stricken at the death of her brother. War raged in the ruins of Fainrow for a few more days when the Louse fleet arrived, before it was all but lost. Orion gathered Myron, Cassiopeia, Colonna, and a few other survivors and left the burning villages and cities behind. They wandered for another few weeks before eventually managing to capture another Laos cruiser and return home. Back to the endless siege on Serengarth, and back to a brutal war that Orion knew could only end one way. Around this time I had some other stuff going on. It was pretty bad for me, and I didn't have much to do with the story for more than a year, I think. But when I did return to it, my outlook on life had changed significantly. And the story began growing darker, and it already kind of had been. Anyway, but it grew even darker. The lice were slowly taking Who's strongholds, closing in on Serengarth, slowly but surely. There were more missions, there were 2 vacations in consecutive years to Washington, D.C., and each time it was an attack on a major Laos city. In the first, Colonna was killed, which left Orion heartbroken, of course. And next year, they tried to destroy a massive super weapon called the Kaga Hirik that was flying towards Serengarth from the city. And this time, Cassiopeia died, although they did manage to destroy the super weapon as well. The story began to grow more and more bleak as my life began to feel more and more meaningless and empty. Again and again, the Who's would fight to the last man and woman to defend a stronghold that was hopelessly outnumbered. The lice began to encroach on Serengarth's territory, battering the strongholds around it, which were usually other features in my yard, other trees or rocks, but one by one they were overrun. Before long, Orion realized that it would not be long before Serengarth itself was destroyed by endless waves of Laos cruisers and fighters and soldiers. So he decided to take what fleet he had left to make one last-ditch attack on the lice. Past the city they'd attacked the last 2 years, even farther south to a place called Casanovac, in the very deep south. They gathered the rest of the fleet that they had and set off. This was a long vacation over Christmas break that lasted for almost a month. On the way south, Orion gathered more and more ships from what Who's they could find, rallying them into a fleet worthy of attacking Casanovac, the heart of Laos territory. We went all the way down to Florida, the first potential location for Casanovac. This turned out to not be a correct location. It wasn't the vital target they were hoping for. Along the way, Orion met a soldier named Emma, who is from Serengarth as well, and he fell in love with her. Although this time he was very cautious, given that none of his love interests had survived very long so far. They continued west, and eventually they did find Casanovac. The siege lasted for 24 hours, and nearly 80% of the Who fleet was destroyed. Casanovac was a titanic city built on the water, its deep orange lights shining through the murky fog, huger than anything else the Who's had ever encountered. One by one, the Who ships were overrun by swarms of Laos fighters, the flaming hulks falling from the sky into the water to be extinguished in its black depth. What was left of the Who fleet retreated to the north. Along the way, they stumbled across a cave in a place where they landed, and were captured by a group of Who's. As it turned out, these Who's lived in a massive cavern miles and miles underneath the earth. They were a mining nation that had fled underground when the lice had attacked them thousands of years ago. There were huge cities down here, at different levels, built into underground mountains, lakes, that reflected no sky but the miles-high ceiling of the cave. Here, Orion saw the potential to fight the lice again, with a fresh fleet that might be able to hold Serengarth for long enough to sink a firm blow into their enemy. Buy some time. But the Underthrown, understandably, were loath to leave their safe underground sanctuary. It wasn't until Orion drew a group of lice to their cave, which resulted in a minor attack that they fought off easily. But that convinced the Underthrown that if they didn't join the fight on their own terms, it would soon come to them regardless. The Underthrown promised aid. They promised to snake through the impossibly long tunnels that led to the vicinity of Serengarth, and burrow back to the earth, not far from the tree. It wasn't a very honest thing for Orion to do, obviously, but he convinced himself that it was for the greater good. And so the rest of the fleet continued back on north, back to a Serengarth that was weak and decaying. Much of the rest of the winter was spent attacking what Laos infrastructure they could, destroying a relatively unguarded SkyTrain tower. When I went cross-country skiing, this was sort of what went through my head, because there was a set of power line towers that cut through the woods where the trails went. And then, in my life, some more bad stuff happened. In the story, Emma was killed as she and Orion fought to reclaim a Who stronghold not far from Serengarth. At the same time, an EMP weapon had hit Serengarth, disabling the weakening shields and giving the Louth fleet free rein to attack. Something inside Orion snapped. He tried to sacrifice himself to destroy as many lice as he could as he flew back to Serengarth and his fighter. He encountered Timeless, battled him viciously as Louth troops swarmed into Serengarth, massacring all inside. Orion almost killed Timeless, but they both fell from the branches as one of the branches was destroyed. When he woke up, he sought shelter in a small house owned by a woman named Serena, who lived in the city that surrounded Serengarth, my driveway. They made plans to escape and hide in the subways underneath the city, but before they got very far, they were captured. Serena was shot. Orion was taken prisoner. In the meantime, Myron's ship landed in the tree, which was quickly being overrun. He managed to get about 200 civilians and soldiers out in his ship, and as they fled Serengarth, the ship was hit and badly damaged. It lingered in the air for a few days, wandering south. A few days after, I went to Boston College to visit it, because I'd been considering applying, which didn't end up happening, but during the visit, as I walked back to my car, Myron's ship crashed into the rocky cliffs surrounding the parking garage. But everyone aboard survived, and Myron and the others emerged from the smoky ruins of their ship into a world that was now all but ruled by the lice. This was a very low point in my life. The story followed my life and my mood quite a bit. It always had. Even as a young child, good and bad things that happened to me would come out in the plot. It was, as a loose allegory for my life, it slowly became more and more interconnected, more and more tightly. I eventually did come up with a reason and a backstory as to why the Who's and the Lice were fighting, and why they existed in the first place. Personally, I'm rather proud of what I came up with, at least insofar as it was created after the fact. I certainly did not have a conscious hand in the plot. It went where it wanted to go, and where I was, I would try to do my best to weave a story from it. Running on the track in middle school for gym class could be an electrifying chase between the Who's and the Lice, or some sort of battle. A family vacation, some sort of natural site, could be a chance to reimagine it as a fantastic location within the world. This isn't to say that I lived in this story, or missed out on real life somehow. I kind of turned to it as an escape during middle school, but I wouldn't say it took anything away from me. There's more to the story that's happened, but I will leave off there for now, because it's a good stopping point. I started writing this story out in novel format a little over 3 years ago, and I just passed 150,000 words not that long ago. It's still very fragmented. It jumps around, starting off in some places and leaving off in others. A whole lot of unfinished threads of the story, but I just wanted to capture as much of it as I could, and jumping around, trying to outline it, was the best I could do. The Lice, I never really imagined what they actually looked like, the individual soldiers, for a long time, until recently. Relatively recent, like the last few years, when I gave them a sort of Nazi-esque aesthetic. They wear these gas masks and these sort of sloped helmets, and you almost never see their faces. And they also had created a whole lot of creatures to fight alongside them with genetic experiments, which ranged from 10 to 12 foot tall humanoids with chain guns and giant bulletproof shields attached to their arms, to crab-like bugs with poisonous stings, or shock suicide troops called breakers, whose bodies were packed with high explosives, so that even once they died, they'd explode, making them deadly beyond the grave. This story's been a part of my life for more than a decade now, and while I don't know where it's going next, I do know that it will continue in my head. It's probably the weirdest part of my life, and as a result, I never told anyone that I know about it. I started a blog for it after some people on the internet found my story interesting, and I've been adding content to this blog ever since. Most of the art, the actual drawings in this video, came from there, and all of them were drawn by me. And I also have online backups of my outline, appendices, and my manuscript on the blog too. So I hope you've enjoyed listening to me tell the story of this strange little piece of my life, and that the few actual drawings were enough to alleviate the terrible Microsoft Paint illustrations, but I figured it was preferable to nothing at all. So thank you for watching, and I hope you found this interesting.